Okay, folks, you're all very welcome back to the afternoon session of Social Justice Ireland's Social Policy Annual Conference. And we are hearing papers today under the theme Social Rights for All, Time to Deliver on the European Pillar of Social Rights. We have 4 speakers this afternoon, and I think we're in for an interesting session. Our first speaker is Hugh Fraser. Hugh is an expert on European policies to combat poverty and social exclusion, especially child poverty. He played a lead role in the feasibility studies that contributed to the establishment of the European Child Guarantee. He has acted as an advisor to a wide range of national and European organisations, including UNICEF and the ESN. The title of Hugh's paper is How the European Pillar of Social Rights Can Help Advance Social Policy in Ireland.
Okay, I'll try and share my screen.
Okay, Hugh.
I think I'm now.
There you are, yeah, perfect.
Great. Okay, thanks. Good afternoon. And first of all, thank you to Social Justice Ireland for the invitation to take part in what is a very timely and I think important conference, because I think the European Pillar of Social Rights is a very interesting development at European level. Just to set a bit of context about my remarks, I think I would agree with those speakers who suggested that the Pillar of Social Rights is an important and ambitious agenda. Having worked on European social policy for the last 2 decades, I think it is probably potentially the most important initiative. And I think it does represent a growing realization at a political level of the need to build a more social and inclusive Europe. And I think it will be important, but there's a big if attached to that, and that is if it is rigorously implemented. If it is, then it can redress the imbalance between economic, employment and social policies. It can provide a very useful framework for building back better post-COVID, and it can help to ensure just and green transitions. However, I would have some reservations about the possibilities. There was a very slow start to the implementation of the Pillar of Social Rights, but I think that has stepped up with the Commission's Action Plan and the Porto Summit. And they are an important steps forward, but we do need to go further. For instance, the poverty target and the sub-target on child poverty, while it's good to have them, they are quite modest and in fact don't match the ambitions set out in the Sustainable Development Goals. The Commission's Action Plan is much more developed in some areas than in others, and certainly in several areas it doesn't go as far as it might in terms of legislative action. So I think several things will be needed if the Pillar is to be a really useful tool for us. It will certainly need continued strong political leadership, and I think also attached to that increased public awareness and support about the rights set out in the Pillar. It will certainly need, and this came up in the morning session, strengthen social governance through effective mainstreaming of the principles in the European semester process and the social scoreboard, and leading to a rebalancing of social and economic priorities, and effectively integrating the social into fiscal policy and also into the digital and green transitions. It will need an increased use of EU legislation to establish enforceable minimum social standards in several areas. It will be important that we avoid cherry picking, that is, only having piecemeal implementation of the Pillar, for example, concentrating more perhaps on things in relation to the labour market at the expense of social protection issues. It will be very important that there is a significant focus on those people who are in the most vulnerable situations when implementing the Pillar, and not just in a few selected areas, but in all areas. And I think it would be important, if we're going to be really effective, to fill some of the data gaps that exist that will be essential for developing effective actions and for monitoring them, and also the timelessness of data. I'm thinking particularly the breakdown of data to cover some of the most vulnerable groups. So let me turn now to look at what I think are sort of 10 overall or general ways that I think we can use the Pillar to have an impact on Irish social policy. The first thing is I think it can help to enhance, it can help to rebalance economic and social policy. There is, in the preamble to the Pillar of Social Rights, it talks about building a more inclusive and sustainable growth model. And I think if the 20 principles on equal opportunities and access to the labour market, on favourable working conditions and on social protection and social inclusion are all implemented, that will in itself lead to a rebalance between economic and social policies, a much stronger look at how economic policies are actually contributing to social goals. Secondly, I think it can help to foster a comprehensive, integrated and strategic approach to issues like poverty and social exclusion. To some extent, that already exists in the Roadmap for Social Exclusion 2020 to 2025, but I think it'll be further reinforced. The Commission's action plan talks a lot about an integrated approach, and I think that that is very welcome. I think the third area it can be helpful is on setting clear goals and targets, and member states are being encouraged to define their own national targets. Now, actually, by European standards, I think Ireland has been quite a good track record and setting goals and targets, and certainly the Roadmap for Social Inclusion does that. But I think we can use the Pillar of Social Rights to review our existing goals and targets and identify areas where perhaps we don't yet have goals and targets, and to develop our targets in relation to the different principles, the 20 principles set out. Sorry, my thing is skipping. Okay, the next way, I think the pillar will help us to enhance data monitoring and accountability. We've heard a bit today about the role of the European semester, and I think if that is really developed properly, it can be extremely useful for actually pushing Irish policy and getting the Commission to encourage Ireland to do more. And this is certainly something that can be taken up by organisations like Social Justice Ireland, who can give information to the Commission about things that are being done well in Ireland, but things that are not being done sufficiently in relation to the pillars. And in my experience, Commission desk officers who are developing country reports and have a key role in developing country-specific recommendations really like informed and good inputs from civil society and from researchers and academics to help them understand the situation and develop their recommendations. I think also there will be an opportunity to identify and fill gaps in data that is needed if we're serious about implementing the pillar. Ireland is better than a lot of countries, in fact, on the data we collect around issues about social inclusion, but there are significant gaps that could be filled, and how the breakdowns of figures to look in more detail at particular groups, and also to look more at how effective policies are actually being in reaching those groups. Certainly, I think that the pillar will encourage us to focus on those most at risk. There's quite a lot of references to those most at risk in the pillar, those most in need, the most vulnerable groups who are underrepresented. And I think also the implementation of the pillar is being linked to the implementation of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, which stress about leaving no one behind and reaching the furthest behind first. At the moment, I think the pillar lags a bit behind that, but hopefully connecting the two will help to reinforce how the pillar is implemented. I think it can also be helpful in tackling discrimination. The Commission are talking about an action plan to combat stereotypes and discrimination in employment, training, social protection, housing and health. And also, I think significantly, allowing for the use of EU funds to support measures to tackle discrimination. And I think that is potentially something we could use here in Ireland. The Commission usefully focuses on gender inequalities, and certainly from a poverty perspective, this is a very important issue. And I think especially Principle 2 on gender equality and 3 on equal opportunities are helpful in this regard. And I think it can help us to strengthen policies on the gender pay gap, on the pension gap, on enhancing family-friendly working, on more provision of early childhood education and care, and on tackling domestic violence. And I think those are all issues that are going to be promoted in the context of the pillar, and we can make use of that. Certainly, I think the pillar will help with transnational learning. It will create new opportunities to see what policies are working best in other countries. And I think we can definitely help and use that to develop what we are doing here in Ireland. Very importantly, I think it should lead to a better use of EU funds to combat poverty. There's a strong link between how EU funds are being used for the period 2021 and 2027 and implementing the pillar of social rights. Very specifically, of course, there is a 25% ESF plus on poverty and social exclusion. But I think other funds here are also important. And I think there's a real chance here to ensure that we use very strategically EU funds, both to use them better to tackle poverty, but also as a lever to get more national investment as well. And then I think the other area that there is potential for the pillar and using it here in Ireland is enhancing the role of civil society in policy making. Again, Ireland is probably one of the better countries in this regard, but I think there's more needs to be done. And there is a recognition that civil society, along with social partners, regional and national authorities, all have roles to play. And I think we should insist on using that. And there's also, again, interestingly, provision in the ESF Plus for building capacity of social partners and civil society organizations. And I think that that can be very helpful. So I think we should be insisting here in Ireland that civil society organizations have a key role in the development of responses to the pillar and in its implementation. But I think also at the same time, our organizations here in Ireland need to liaise with the European networks that are working at European level to push the Commission to do more in the implementation process. The next thing I want to turn to is some more specific policies areas that I think that the pillar can be helpful on here in Ireland. And I've highlighted 5 of them. The one I'm going to talk most about is child poverty, because that's the issue I've been working on, well, a lot for the last 3 years, but in fact, generally over the last 20 years at European level. And I think that we have real opportunities there. So it is striking, I think, that the principle 11 of the Pillar of Social Rights, which looks at the issue of childcare, but also specifically at the issue of children not growing up in poverty. And I think that that is very importantly developed in the EU Child Guarantee. It's probably one of the most developed aspects of the Pillar of Social Rights. And that really is because the work on the Child Guarantee happened over a 3-year period from 2018 at the same time as the Commission was developing its action plan. And there was an early, very strong political commitment from the President of the Commission to have an EU Child Guarantee in response to a demand from the European Parliament. So I think we have, in fact, a very strong lever to enhance policies here in Ireland on child poverty. First of all, I think it will help to enhance us having a comprehensive and strategic approach. We do have a certain amount of coordination on policies and a strategic approach in relation to children, but we now have to develop this action plan to implement the Child Guarantee by March 22. And this should go significantly beyond where we currently are on policies to tackle poverty. It is a really significant opportunity, providing we really push the government to do something radical in response. And it should also be backed, and this is in the Child Guarantee, by a broadly based supporting, enabling policy framework. I think it will also help us to focus more on children's rights and recognizing in different areas that we should be developing policies, not just as options of things we should develop, but they are rights that need to be delivered to all children, and particularly those in vulnerable situations. And I think in this regard, the Ombudsman for Children here in Ireland could play an important role in ensuring that we're keeping children's rights at the heart of the implementation of the Child Guarantee. The Child Guarantee puts a lot of focus on identification of children most in need, and we will have to do that very carefully and strategically when we're developing our national action plan. And again, I list some of the groups that clearly should be highlighted in that. But I think it will also need to have disaggregated data on these children and on their current access to services and where the gaps are and where services are too weak or not meeting their needs. The Child Guarantee will help to enhance policy coordination. And I think the fact that every country has had to appoint a national Child Guarantee coordinator is important. We also, of course, have some degree of coordination here, having a Department of Children, which is more than many countries do. But I think this will give a very specific focus on poverty and social exclusion issues for children in coordinating that across government. And I hope that we will have a really dynamic role from the national coordinator. Certainly, having the child guarantee will lead to enhanced monitoring and reporting. There have to be biannual reporting on progress, and it will also be linked into the European semester process. And interestingly, the Social Protection Committee is developing a common monitoring framework for the child guarantee at European level. So I think we have a chance to feed into that and to enhance our own monitoring here in Ireland in response to that. I've mentioned before, but very specifically in relation to children, the enhanced use of EU funds is very important. It's an area we studied a lot in the feasibility study, and across Europe, very weak identification of how much EU funds have been used to support children in the past. The Commission couldn't tell us, they didn't have the evidence, nobody was collecting this. Now it's required to use EU funds to support the implementation of the child guarantee, and 5% of ESF plus has to be used in countries like Ireland that have high levels of child poverty. So again, that's a very useful lever also to get more national funds in addition to the strong use of EU funds. Certainly, we will see in relation to children an enhanced policy role for civil society and for children themselves and those most at risk. And we have quite a good track record on that in Ireland, but I think we can build on that further. And there certainly is a strong emphasis in the child guarantee on involving a broad range of stakeholders and specifically children in the development, implementation and monitoring process. And then in terms of specific policy actions, the child guarantee actually spells out in the different areas that it covers, the early childhood education, access to healthcare, nutrition and housing. It spells out a range of policies that one would expect to see in place and to be developed. So I think we can test what is in place in Ireland against that range and use it as a way of examining our policies. And when we start the process of developing the action plan, we can see where the gaps and the weaknesses currently are. And then very specifically, if I had to suggest sort of 3 ambitions that I'd like to see in the child guarantee action plan, amongst many other things. First of all, I would hope that we would establish a clear scientific basis for setting and regularly updating adequate levels of minimum wages and income support for families and children in need to ensure their well-being and their development. And I think here we can again in Ireland build on the work that's been done by the Centre Partnership for Social Justice on reference budgets. Secondly, I would like to see work towards establishing state-provided system of free childcare and after-school provision. I think the issue that came up more than anything else in the feasibility studies was the importance of early intervention. And we shouldn't leave it to chance or ad hoc projects. I think we now ought to be putting in or working towards putting in place a proper state provision for all children and ensuring that the children who are most in need benefit from that. And then the other critical issue clearly here in Ireland is the right to housing for families with children. And I think we should ensure that that is in the plan, and we ensure that there's a dramatic increase in supply of social housing, and within that then a better targeting of children and families in vulnerable situations. Very quickly to move on to the other areas, in terms of inequality and income adequacy, I think the pillar is quite helpful here. In terms of low pay and insecure employment, I think principles 5 to 10 on fair employment can be very useful in terms of tackling issues of adequate wages. And I think the proposal for a directive on adequate minimum wages that the Commission is proposing can be very helpful. And I was struck when I was listening to Bear this morning, the extent to which he says low wages across countries have been one of the factors in limiting progress and setting the levels of social protection. So I think it's a very important issue, but also here in Ireland, and again, it came out during COVID, was working conditions for many people in poor working conditions. Then on social protection, we have a principle 13 on and adequate unemployment benefits, and 14 on adequate income. And I think those again are important. I think it was slightly disappointing that the Commission is only proposing a council recommendation on minimum income. I know this being an area of debate for some years now, but a lot of experts consider it is actually possible to have a framework directive, which would be a stronger legislative base. And hopefully we could work towards that, but at least a strong council recommendation on minimum income can be useful in making progress in that area. In terms of housing exclusion and homelessness, Again, I think it's very useful to have Principle 19 on housing and assistance for homelessness. And I think one of the important developments is the establishment of a European platform on combating homelessness. And I would agree with FIANSA, which is the umbrella body for organizations working on homelessness, that this platform can become a motor for progress in tackling homelessness in Ireland. And we certainly need a motor here in Ireland. But again, I think it's a bit disappointing that the Commission Action Plan doesn't actually set a target on homelessness. Certainly we should do that here in Ireland. Access to essential services. I think, again, the pillar is helpful here. My impression, having spent the last 20 years working at European level, that Irish policy has, by the best European performance standards, been rather imbalanced, that we focus far more on developing income support than ensuring access to high quality, inclusive, accessible, and affordable essential services. And I think that COVID has shone the spotlight on the persistent inequalities in access to good quality services. So I think we need not to any way weaken what we're doing in social protection, but also to do more focus on developing access to essential services. And again, I think we can use the principles in the pillar here to redress the existing imbalance. Principle 1 on the right to quality and inclusive education and training and lifelong learning. Principle 16, looking at preventative and curative healthcare of good quality. Principle 18 on the right to long-term care services and community-based services, and Principle 20 of the pillar on access to essential services. I think all those are useful tools that we can use for arguing a stronger focus on good services here in Ireland. And then just to touch on my final area is the digital and green transitions. And I think it is striking that the Commission's action plan links the implementation of the pillar on social rights with the digital and green transitions. And I think it will be absolutely crucial that they are linked together in the context, particularly of the European semester. And I think we can use it here in Ireland. If you apply all the principles and use them to look at what's being done in terms of the digital and green transitions, I think they can really help us to get a stronger, just transition. There's no guarantee it will happen, but I think the fact we have those principles which provide a prism through which we can look at what's been done in terms of the digital and green policies can be quite helpful as we move forward. So just in conclusion, I would repeat that I think that the pillar of social rights is a very important political recognition of build more inclusive and fair societies and to build a more social Europe. I think it is potentially a really important tool for building back post-COVID. But I think this will depend on effective implementation and continuous and visible assessment of progress being made. So thus I would end by saying, in this regard, the role of NGOs and policy analysts should be to use the EPSR principles to hold government to account for ensuring that there are effective policies in place that will deliver on the 20 principles. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Hugh. Very interesting indeed, and I particularly note your final point about NGOs and associated groups holding the government to account and implementing the principles. That is definitely something I think that every one of us can play a role in one form or another. And as I say, I may not have mentioned it, sorry, at the beginning of the afternoon session, the Q&A function. Please, any questions you have for any of our panelists, with 4 speakers this afternoon, please put them into the function, into the Q&A, and we will deal with them collectively once we have finished our 4 speakers. Now, next up is Sheamus Boland. Sheamus is an expert in rural and agricultural affairs with over 30 years experience in dealing with communities and policymakers as the CEO of Irish Rural Link. He has helped to build a national rural network of 600 community organisations which are involved in activities designed to enhance the economic and social development of their areas. Sheamus is also a farmer and currently the president of the European Economic Social Council Diversity Group 3. The Diversity Group is made up of delegates drawn from each member state representing sectors which include community, agriculture, environment, consumer, social economy, and various professions. And the title of Sheamus's paper today is implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much to the organisers of the Social Justice Conference on this subject. And indeed, I'm honoured to be asked to speak to you. I suppose what I'm looking at in terms of the excellent presentation given by Hugh, which goes through the 20 principles very well and shows and demonstrates how they can be implemented, is to say, well, can we implement them? And what sort of roadmap are we actually going to show and demonstrate that we can do it? And my approach in this paper that I've written really is to look at our history in terms of recent times. How did we approach the financial recession in Europe, and particularly as it affected us here in Ireland? How did we approach the pandemic crisis, and how, as a collective, in terms of people, in terms of government, and finally looking at the role of us in terms of civil society. It is well known that in civil society terms, we have been a long time talking about the kind of illustrations of what should be a fair and just society. Organisations like Social Justice Ireland, and I would like to think Irish Rural Link, and many, many more, were established to try and bring fairness and equality into our society. And it's taken a long time, and notwithstanding the help of the EU in many cases. When you look at equal pay, when you look at a range of rights, they've really been brought in at the behest of EU first, making them as directives and then forcing us almost to bring them into our legislation. So let's, as Hugh outlined, the document with the 20 pillars are really and truly historic. They do document very well the kind of roadmap we should have. And you would like to think that in terms of being fair and in terms of success, that we would integrate them into our economic models. Because if we don't do that, then they become on the virgins, on the side, and they just are implemented as a kind of afterthought. This paper is also given by me in the context of Europe and my role as Diversity Europe President. And I'm looking at the moment at the role, for example, of Poland, of Hungary in particular. These two countries are not alone unlikely to implement many of the Pillar of Social Rights, but are actually railing against them. And you could ask the question, will the EU, having produced this Pillar of Social Rights, how far will it go to try and persuade member states to do so? And again, Hugh has given a very good outline of how Ireland should approach this. So when I look at Ireland, I think, well, you know, the EU said it would eradicate poverty by 2021. The fact is the numbers have remained more or less the same, 118 million still across the European Union in poverty, despite 10 years of saying that they would implement it. And the reason it didn't succeed was, quite frankly, individual member states found ways and means of not implementing the very laudable principles outlined in that policy document. And so we go to the financial crisis. Ireland took a very strong role in dealing with the financial crisis, best described as the austere route. And the austere route basically took into account the fact that we needed to balance our books as quickly as possible. We needed to dispense with a range of programs that might have been regarded as social. We had cuts in education, we had cuts in health, we had cuts in transport, we had cuts in a whole range of services. Yes, we managed to keep the social payments pretty much on a level as they were. We didn't reduce them. In many cases, we didn't reduce them at all, we increased them. But in a sense, we actually made it more difficult, because by cutting the services, we effectively put more and more people on waiting lists. And in terms of the more poorer areas in society, this impacted on these areas quite significantly. So in a sense, by taking the austere route, we effectively abandoned things like eradicating poverty by 2021. We abandoned a whole range of European well-documented papers which said we would achieve a range of equalities. The austere route, as it happens, meant we congratulated ourselves on bringing ourselves into, I suppose, a better place financially. But the reality is we still have a legacy from that austerity, and that legacy really hasn't gone away. If you look at one of the aims of the pillar of social rights, it talks about having at least 60% of adults participating in training by 2030. If you take just one segment, and let's be really economic for the moment, let's take the building industry. The fact of the matter is we have a dearth of young people training in this industry at the moment. So much so that that has consequence in terms of finding people to work in the area of provision of housing and building in general. That is the direct result of the legacy of cutting all of the apprentice positions, all of the education positions during the economic crisis. And therefore, you have to ask yourself, was that the correct approach? So in a way, member states, and you could go through each member state and you would find similar examples of the way in which they managed to circumvent laudable documents, as I said, like getting rid of poverty. And when you look at the other one, like at least 78% of the population between 20 and 64 should be in employment by 2030. Hopefully, that can still be achieved. I'm not going to be as pessimistic about that, but it's a tall order. And a reduction of at least 15 million in the number of people at risk of poverty and social exclusion by the end of the decade. Again, 15 million when you consider, this is across Europe, when you consider there's 118 million in poverty, is probably a very conservative approach in total. So in a sense, you could say that the legacy of the financial banking crisis, which hit Europe and the world, and Ireland in particular, has managed to drive a coaching forward through many of the progressive social documents that we have produced. Which is why I'm asking the question, can we now look at how we managed the pandemic? You could argue that the pandemic was managed the complete opposite way to the financial recession. Because of the looming crisis, we decided to quickly send people back home. We created effectively a universal payment system. And if I remember, my good friend and great man in our society, Sean Healy, was talking about a universal system of income before it was even regarded as a sentence. Yet we effectively adopted a system of universal payments in terms of income because we needed people to stay at home, people who had to stay at home and therefore couldn't work and do their jobs. We still had to maintain them with an income, so we established a POPE. So we completely did the opposite to what we did during the economic crisis. More than that, we managed to find the resources with the help of the EU, it has to be said, to bring the vaccines to everybody, to bring a distribution system that was as equal as you can get, and to try and ensure through the management of the ECB and the funding mechanisms there, that Europe would not go broke, that Europe would afford this massive jolt in the economy that was predicted. And now we're hearing that in Ireland, the jolt in the economy may not have been as terrible as we thought. And I suppose, Chair, what I would ask you to think about, remember again at the beginning of the recession, when we were told that if we didn't do these austere measures, we would be in a very, very bad place by now. That was not said at the beginning of the pandemic because, frankly, we needed to act in the pandemic, and the last thing we needed was people out of work with no income. So we had to find a different approach. And that's my question. If we're talking about the implementation of the pillar of social rights, are we actually seriously going to adopt a different approach? We cannot implement the pillar of social rights unless we do so by including them in our economic models. We cannot, therefore, have a hope of achieving any of the aims unless the money is there to make them happen. That means the investment in education. It means the investment in health. It means the investment in a whole range of well-being. That includes the likes of mental health services. That includes a range of programs that seem to be always kept outside of, let's call it, the rather narrow parameters of improving the economy first and hoping all boats will be lifted. So I would say in conclusion, it's necessary to note that despite the action plan's promises that the pillar of social rights will be delivered, the facts demonstrate that we have in Europe around 20% below the poverty line. So we have got to achieve that. Hugh talked about the reliance on Europe to deliver. I hope we can. But looking at the challenges within the EU, particularly from Poland and Hungary, and other countries, I should say, this will be extremely difficult. And if you look at the way we deliver international agreements, we somehow manage to get derogations. I said in my paper that in Ireland, the most famous derogation was the famous peat and boglands derogation that we got for 10 years. We never should have got that, in truth. And we paid a huge price for it in the end because we still had to implement it, but we lost 10 years of conservation. That's just an example of even Ireland, as Hugh said, a better country than most at managing European directives, and still we do pull very slow. And even when I look at the government's own report on this, there is an emphasis on how the social pillar of rights links to the economics rather than the social system. I suppose what I'm saying is this: to be successful, it needs to be embedded in the wider macroeconomic policy. It needs to include in a real way all relevant civil society organizations. We as community and voluntary pillar, which I'm part of, and so is Social Justice Ireland along with 15 others, we were part of an experiment for about 15 years of social partnership. That needs to return, because the civil society organizations who worked so well during the pandemic and who continue to be at the coalface have proposed many solutions in the past and have solutions in the future. And they need to be taken into account if you're going to deliver this. The pillar of social rights in European terms, I have a fear that it has lost steam because the emphasis is on, rightly so, climate change. Hugh mentioned the first principle of the SDGs, which is poverty. We seem to forget in the 17 SDGs that poverty should be part of it. And I have to say, looking at the COP deliberations, the COP26 deliberations, I didn't see much talk about the management of poverty and its eradication. So finally, let me say this, Chair. If we are going to have a delivery of this pillar of social rights, we need all government, the economic interests, and the community and voluntary sector involved. We need proper proposals on the table, and probably we need a cabinet minister to deliver it. Otherwise, it'll be one of these, I'm afraid, ideas that was really good, brilliant, like the eradication of poverty by 2021. It just didn't happen. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Sheamus. And as I say, more very interesting food for thought, and no doubt we will return to some of it in our discussion following the completion of the other papers. The next paper we have is from Tom McDonald. Tom is co-director of the Nevin Economic Research Institute, and he's based in Dublin. He specialises in economic growth, economics of innovation, Irish and European economics of innovation, Irish and European economies, and fiscal policy. He previously worked as an economist at Task, the think tank, and before that he was a lecturer in economics at NUI Galway and at DCU. On McDonald's paper, Where Do We Go From Here? Principles for the 2020s Economy, a Playbook.
Thanks so much, Chair. Can you guys see my screen?
Can see you there now, Tom. Yeah, and we can hear you. Yeah,
perfect.
What's up?
Thanks, Mick, our Chair. Thanks, Chair. And thanks to Social Justice Ireland for inviting me. It's been a stimulating set of papers. And look, there's been a lot to kind of think about. And one of the things that I want to do is to rehabilitate economics, or at least to rehabilitate a certain type of economics, and to show that there isn't necessarily, or that there isn't at all, a tension between economic growth on one side, climate sustainability on the other, and poverty and equality as a kind of a third dimension. I was really struck by the comment earlier about a social trilemma between budgetary restraint, income inequality, and employment growth. And I'm always struck at how there's this contrast between employment growth, or what's good for the economy, and incentives and so forth on one side, versus poverty and inequality on the other. And I think it's possible to show that actually, rather than being substitutes, they're actually complements. So, I mean, why should we look at economics? Didn't predict a 2008 crash, often gets things wrong. But it's good to think of economics as not necessarily a doctrine, but it's made up of a variety of schools of thought, which often come at problems from different angles, and often have different policy prescriptions, and often there can be a political economy dimension to this, that you're often arguing your case for your particular group in society, and for good reason. Economics is very much within the school of social sciences rather than physical sciences. But if we think of economics as a conceptual framework, or a set of models, we can look at how it can help us see how it can contribute to long-term economic and social well-being. So it's important to kind of step back for a moment, and we do talk about not hitting poverty targets and so forth, and instability in terms of the climate and so forth. But over a 200-year period, it's unquestionably a fact that the standard of material well-being for most people living in developed economies today is superior in almost every respect to living standards of even the wealthiest people just 100 years ago. Health, nutrition, education, communication, transport, entertainment. But there have been, of course, downsides to this. Most obviously, significant environmental costs, air pollution, water pollution. Now we're seeing a rise in global temperatures. In addition, many people outside of the developed economies have not been benefiting from the economic growth of the last 200 years. And indeed, some elements of that growth have been based upon exploitation. But the question is, we have made this phased transition over the last 200 years, whereby the last 200 years are very, very different from the thousands of years before. So something has happened. So economic growth is important as an input into people's economic and social well-being, but of course, there are important caveats associated with that. For example, an economic system that generates highly unequal growth will arguably be politically unstable over the long run. In addition, it will obviously be inefficient at reducing poverty. It will gradually erode social capital and indeed trust. And indeed, there's other forms of economic growth that are equally undesirable. Most obviously, in modern terms, we think of growth from environmentally damaging practices, which entail enormous costs, particularly on future generations. So in a sense, current and previous generations are stealing quality of life from future generations. So there's that intergenerational inequality that's there. And of course, there are many items that are not considered at all within the economic growth statistics, caring and voluntarism being the most obvious examples. I could go on. We can think of the tax cuts and deregulation and monetary policy that facilitated the pro-cyclical housing boom in Ireland and indeed the booms that burst in other European countries leading up to 2008. Clearly, that was an unsustainable form of growth, not one that one would want to replicate. The question is, how do you stop it from happening again? So the element of counter-cyclicality becomes very, very important there. So if it's not growth per se that we want, what in fact is our primary economic goal? Well, I would argue, and I suspect everyone at this conference would agree, that we should strive for sustainable and inclusive improvements in the living standards for everybody over the long term. So it's economic growth isn't the goal. Maybe something we can argue about the language. It could be tuned, but broadly, I think most people would accept something along those lines. And if this is reasonable, then we have to look at what are the high-level design principles that will allow us to achieve this goal. So a potential policy playbook could be broken into three parts. One, growth in the economy's productive capacity, which is different from economic growth itself. So you could build a productive capacity based on things like education, R&D, infrastructure, and so forth, investments which can have long-term gains, but which might actually be bad for growth in the short term. So somebody leaves their job, goes into education, it's bad for the economy in the short run, but it's an investment in the future. Second, income adequacy and closer economic equality. Part of that, of course, is decommodification of universal basic services, keeping the cost of living as low as possible. There's obviously an intergenerational component to this as well, based upon where you are in your life cycle. And then finally, long-run sustainability, which must be considered across all dimensions. So there's a fiscal component to this, there's a climate component to this. Obviously, there's long-term challenges in areas such as demographics that have to be considered as well. So I'm often drawn into the debate about degrowth, and I'm asked, what do I think about that? And what I try to do when I'm asked that question is to kind of differentiate between different types of economic growth. The classic economic growth, which one thinks about over the last 200 years, based upon smokestack factories and the like, is based upon the deployment of ever more resources: people, land, materials, infrastructure, machinery, capital goods. But this in any event is constrained in the long run in a finite finite planet. There's only so many people. We have aging demographics, so the number of people employed is going to fall inevitably anyway. But we also have limited resources in terms of the stock of nature, for example. Even if one wanted to try and use all of them. But there is a different type of growth. That's extensive growth. The other type of growth is known as intensive growth. And this is growth where you use less resources to achieve the same outcome, or use the same amount of resources to achieve growth potentially. And this, at least conceptually, allows us to continue economic development, which is probably a better way to think about it than economic growth, without it allows us to, without damaging the planet long term. Now, of course, this relies upon constant embodied technological change and innovation. It could come from scale economies, it could come from more efficient use of resources. It's very, very hard to achieve. And traditionally, this productivity-based growth is about 1% per year, which suggests that may be the sustainable level of growth in real terms. Going into the future. It's historically at its highest around the middle of the 20th century, in excess of 2% in many places. It can be higher than that in developing economies now because we're catching up. But broadly, that seems to be what's achievable. And in the long run, it is the only sustainable source of economic development. So knowledge is power, of course, but one of the problems is the private market will always underproduce it, because the private gains to investing in knowledge are lower than the social gains to investing in knowledge. There's a number of reasons for this, but any potential positive spillovers that can't be captured by the firm means that the firm will not value it at its social level, and therefore there will be underproduction of knowledge relative to the socially optimal amount. So inability to fully internalize the benefits, uncertainty in production is another potential barrier. And yet knowledge is fundamental to achieving sustainable economic development that is not destructive of the planet. Joel Moker describes the generation and application of new knowledge as the wellspring or lever of riches that propels economies forward. And it's worth thinking about what we mean by a new idea. So these new ideas are the wellspring, but for an economist, a new idea is simply a new instruction or set of instructions for transforming inputs into outputs, or more evocatively, for transforming nature to better suit human needs. So it could be as simple as currently takes 76 steps to make a shirt. Can you do it in 75 steps? Is there a more efficient way to do it? And then once you've discovered that way, everyone can do it in that way, and that's an efficiency gain. Or it could be the development of a slightly sharper knife, or it could be a completely new product, such as the steam engine, which can have a transformative effect on the economy overall. So you often hear about innovations discussed in economics. What do we mean by innovations? Well, innovations are simply, it's just a catch-all term for combinations of existing ideas. So your ideas plus the other person, you talk to each other, there's cross-fertilization, a new idea is developed. To the extent that that manifests as a product or a service or a process or a new market or even a new organization, that is what an innovation is. And that's, so inculcating these innovations is what generates economic growth long term. And every economy has what's known as an innovative system. So the innovative system is the system of actors and institutions that are interacting with each other to generate innovations. So it could be universities, it could be households, it could be business, it could be government. Any interaction is part of the innovation system. And the economy's innovative capacity is its ability to generate these innovations over time. So rather than generating economic growth in the short term, what we actually want to have is a strong innovative capacity, because this innovative capacity will determine our long-term productive capacity. So that's what it is. It's a network of individuals, each with ideas and also sources of knowledge that one can access. So what helps in terms of innovative capacity? What are we looking at from a policy point of view? Well, types and levels of education and skills in the population, the densities and flows within the networks between, say, business and universities, individuals and businesses, and universities' cost of accessing knowledge, government R&D policies, the quality of capital markets to allow new firms to set up, amongst other things. And all of this combined forms the innovation in an ecosystem. And this innovative capacity is what drives long-run productive capacity. There's often a misunderstanding as well about what innovation it is. It's best not to think of it as scientists and in lab coats. Most innovation is simply the diffusion of technology. You buy a computer, you are now more effective. It's simply diffused to you. You didn't have to develop it yourself. And the vast majority of productivity gains come from the fusion of technology. And that makes it easier for less developed economies to generate higher levels of productivity growth year on year. And of course, fundamental to this process is communication and access. What about private sector? Often a mistake to provide tax breaks or tax cuts. The government will always be the most significant actor. It can make direct inputs in terms of science and education. It sets the rules of the game, provides fiscal and other incentives, and it can counteract structural market failures. So the government must have a central role to play within the innovative system. And the key policy levers are investment in education and lifelong reskilling for human capital, investment in child poverty reduction and social environment for human potential. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that child poverty is the single most damaging thing you can have in terms of the economy's long-run innovative capacity, because once a child falls behind or is in a non-appropriate environment in terms of developing human potential, it's very, very difficult to catch up. So economists like James Heckman, for example, have looked at the returns to early education, childcare, reduction of child poverty. So reduction of poverty, particularly for children, is a fundamental input into the long-term health of the economy. And failure to end that poverty is obviously a tragedy for that child and the child's family, but it's also a false economy. And of course, there's all the other areas that we know well: investment in machinery, equipment, and infrastructure, investment in production, diffusion of new ideas through public R&D, and having the appropriate rules of the game in terms of legal system, levels of corruption, regulatory environment, fiscal policy, and so on. Education is worth thinking about for a moment. The OECD have studied this, and they contend that half of the growth achieved by OECD countries in the second half of the 20th century was driven by progress in education. And the United States invested earlier in education and was ahead of Europe for quite a while. And they had faster or higher levels of productivity growth, in particular after World War II. And there was an enormous collaboration between business and government sectors as well, and higher level in the development of new technologies. Famously, Mariano Mazzucato has looked at the development of the iPhone and pointed out that almost every single innovation associated with it was developed by the public sector. And crucially for education policy, it's not just about elite institutions. It's not just about PhDs or masters or whatever. It's the skill levels for the population as a whole that matter, as well as the top of the achievement distribution. So it's education and human capital for everyone that actually matters. So this justifies policies such as free education, early education, and so forth. And as I pointed out before, poverty can have extremely damaging and lasting effects on people's ability to develop their human capital. In Ireland's case in particular, the per pupil spending gap on education is about 3 billion, and we have a chronic underspend as well on public R&D of about 900 million. Alongside this, of course, we need to have a proper regulatory regime, and it's not just about productivity. Of course, we do want to maximize our employment rates. And that means reducing barriers to employment. Hours work do matter. So no-brainer policy reforms in an Irish case at least would be reducing childcare costs. I would say reducing them to zero should be the goal. Using counter-cyclical policies, so that would imply not using austerity during a recession. That's economic madness. Moving away from means-tested benefits to universal benefits. You having refundable tax credits, which is effectively a negative income tax, would be beneficial as well. All of these things can help in terms of employment. Also, ongoing learning and reskilling for the population at large can also enable people to move from sector to sector. That will be particularly important in the future as we have to just transition away from zero carbon. In terms of private investment, tax breaks are often a mistake. They tend to distort the market. There's a lot of deadweight loss. Better strategy there is to ensure that you reduce barriers to firm entry and exit, allow failures, but also provide early finance to enable new firms to be born. And then in terms of investment, type of investment really does matter. Bridges to nowhere, that's not what we're talking about. It's particularly investments contributing to knowledge-based growth, such as broadband infrastructure, school buildings, research institutes such as universities, and so forth. In terms of inequality then, I'll just briefly look at two areas. First of all, fiscal policy. And this is relevant because of the point earlier about, you know, this kind of either or between employment and growth on one side and inequality on the other. Well, the IMF have stated that excess inequality can lead to slower and more fragile growth. And it's not the position of the IMF and the OECD and those bodies to contrast the two. Inequality is bad for economic development. What can we do? Well, on fiscal policy, we can do a lot to act as a corrective to market inequality. Progressive tax policy, strong welfare benefits, strong social insurance system, decommodification through provision of universal basic services. And look, you can increase taxes in ways that are economically efficient. Taxes on wealth and land, eliminating tax expenditures. Those are easy wins. And it's also possible to increase consumption taxes in a way that's conducive to low levels of economic inequality. The Nordic countries all have very high taxes on consumption. They also have very, very high levels of public spending. If the taxes are going on social welfare or universal basic services, they can reduce inequality overall. And I think it's worth thinking about more radical proposals, such as free and widely available public transport. In the Irish case, that would assist with climate goals, important in terms of the sequencing for the carbon adjustment. Policies like universal basic income and guaranteed minimum income have been discussed generally at length, and certainly there's a lot to be said about those policies if done properly. But alongside fiscal policy, there's also the issue of the labour share when it comes to inequality. Ireland in particular has a very low labour share, so the income of the economy as a whole goes to labour or goes to capital. A greater share for capital means greater inequality because wealth is very highly concentrated and much more highly concentrated than income in every economy. So if there's a greater share going to capital income, that breeds higher levels of economic inequality. So we want a high labour share. What can we do? Well, wage floors, minimum wages, living wages are part of it, but probably the most important reform long term will be to enhance the bargaining power of labour, collective bargaining agreements, strong labour market institutions. And there is evidence that the decline in trade union density is correlated with declining labour shares. Even within the labour share, you can have excessive inequality. What can you there? Again, trade unions are relevant because they're associated with wage compression. So less inequality within firms and within sectors. That makes sense from the workers' point of view because the median income tends to be lower than the mean income, and becomes harder for high-skilled individuals to grab too large a piece of the pie, and other things such as value and care work, of course, as well. And then I suppose I'll finish up in a minute or two. Obviously, growth is of mere temporary value if it's unsustainable. We all know about the environmentally damaging economic model that is manifestly unsustainable. But there's other forms of instability too, or unsustainability rather. Asset booms, as you saw prior to 2008, loose macro policy. We see the importance of long-run planning. We now have macroprudential rules in central banks. We have hopefully learned from the fiscal policy mistakes of 2008. So this crisis, the COVID crisis response, has been one that is very much counter-cyclical in nature. But long-term, the big challenge is for industrial and growth policy will be to focus on this just transition to a decarbonised economy. And that's going to be enormously difficult. Entire sectors from agriculture to transport will be heavily affected. And there's very much a lock-in problem here because people's standard of living are associated with particular economic practices that they're locked into. Sectors like transport are dependent upon diesel and will take significant investments to move to a new model. And if we're not to leave people behind, and if you leave people behind, then your transition becomes politically unsustainable. You're going to have to provide them with alternatives. So sequencing is crucial here. There must be alternatives and supports. The transition can be an opportunity as well as a threat. And I mean, it goes without saying that we're going to need investment in clean and renewable energy production, retrofitting of houses, affordable and available public transport. I would make public transport free. There's going to have to be investment in sustainable food production, in rewilding, in broadband, remote working. The list goes on. And the cost is going to be a number of percentage points of GNI star every single year, which is going to have implications for government revenue. And all of this is happening at a time when our demographics are deteriorating because of the wonderful fact that life expectancy is increasing. But that will mean that our employment rates, our employment levels per capita will fall. So just to conclude then, I would suggest that 21st century high-level economic policy should take a multi-pronged approach across three main dimensions. Let's look at our high-level design principles and look at it from a strategic point of view. First of all, we want to enhance our innovative capacity and remove employment barriers. So that means free childcare, investment in education, investment in R&D, investment in infrastructure, investment in ending poverty. Second of all, ensuring income adequacy and adequacy of services and pursuing greater economic equality. That means we have to be very careful in terms of how we design fiscal policy. It has implications for labour market institutions and wage bargaining, and it has implications for minimum wage policies and for welfare policy. And this is going to be particularly important in terms of the debate that occurs in Ireland over the next year in terms of the new Commission on Taxation and Welfare, and I would certainly encourage everyone to submit to that body. And then finally, we need to engage in foresight to identify sustainability shocks that are coming and to make those strategic adjustments to policy to respond to these shocks in good time. We didn't do this for the environment when we should have done it, and now the costs are going to be ever more. And the longer we delay, the harder the transition is going to be for the future generations, and the worse their quality of life will be. Finally, it's the overall system that matters. So a particular policy might fail on some dimension, but this does not mean it should inherently be excluded from consideration. So carbon tax being a classic example. It's regressive, but it's an important component of the zero carbon transition. So I'll leave it at that, and because I'm probably way over time, so I will stop and leave it at that. Thanks, Chair.
Getting used to the technology. Thanks very much, Tom. Thank you. And you were not way over time, in fairness to you. You did very well there, Tom. Okay, and moving on to our last paper before we have something of a discussion, hopefully, at the end of it. And this comes from Colette Bennett. Colette is economic and social analyst with Social Justice Ireland. She joined the organisation in 2018, having spent almost a decade engaged with social policy and advocacy work on behalf of a large debt organisation and in a volunteer capacity with organisations such as the Simon Community, FLAC and Unseal. In December 2016, Colette led an EU special mission to Cyprus to support insolvency services to implement their insolvency solutions for low-income debtors. Colette is a member of the Irish Social Policy Association, and her paper is entitled Delivering Social Rights for Ireland.
Of course, I'm also mute. Thank you very, very much. I will now try to share my screen, so hopefully everybody will see this. Can you see my slides there now?
Yeah, I can see that now, Colette.
Great stuff. So, thank you very much. I suppose what I'm going to be looking at, and I suppose thank you very much for everybody who has stayed on as well. It's been quite a long day, but certainly a worthwhile one, I hope. I'm going to take a brief look at the Agenda 2030 issues in Ireland, concentrating on poverty and social inclusion, on employment, on education, very briefly on taxation, before considering some of the policies that are necessary to meet the challenges we face in the next decade. Sorry, hopefully you can all see that. So this table here obviously looks at key poverty indicators across the EU, and those same indicators then for Ireland. So you can see, for example, the number of people in Ireland at risk of poverty or social inclusion reduced slightly from 1.05 million people in 2008 to 1.01 million people in 2019. The number at risk of poverty using the 60% of median income metric then reduced from 686,000 in 2008 to 245,000 people in 2019. But interestingly, while poverty decreased slightly, whichever of those two metrics you used, severe deprivation actually increased. So from 245,000 in 2008 to 267,000 in 2019. And similarly, the number of people in a household with very low work intensity increased from 509,000 to 534,000. So you can see, while there were some improvements, there's still a lot of work still to be done. In terms then, the number of people in poverty is very much the same as it was a decade ago. Now, it did rise dramatically in the period immediately after 2008, and then from 2016 onwards, there was a decline in the level of poverty risk. Now, our analysis suggests that the income distribution effects of recent budgets, certainly looking at the period from 2017 to 2021, is in budget 2021, indicates that budgetary policy resulted in all household types recording an increase in their disposable income. And the larger gains experienced by welfare-dependent households explain much of the reasons why the levels of poverty and income inequality have fallen during those years. We obviously warmly welcome those, because our consistent message in advance of those budgets was to reverse the regressive policy choices that were previously implemented, and to prioritise those households with the least resources and the most needs. And both Tom and Sheamus spoke about the need to move away from those austerity policies during a time of recession. However, the analysis also reveals that budgets 2020 and 2021 shifted away from that approach. So it risks the reversal of much of that recent progress in relation to inequalities. Following the last budget just gone in budget 2022 in October, we welcomed the €5 increase in core social welfare rates, but we were disappointed that it didn't go so far to benchmark social welfare against average earnings. In fact, the real value of core social welfare rates is set to fall in the coming years due to rising inflation. We had proposed an annual €10 increase over 2 years to meet the benchmark as a stepping stone towards the minimum essential standard of living. And failure by government to adopt that proposal means that the standard of living of many people, particularly those who depend on social welfare, will fall further behind the rest of society. Now, of course, poverty isn't just about social welfare dependent households. They're not the only ones that are experiencing poverty. And according to the latest CSO data, 5% of those who are employed are living at risk of poverty. So that's approximately 100,000 workers. Over time, poverty figures for the working poor have shown very little movement, reflecting a persistent problem with low earnings. And many working families on low earnings struggle to achieve that basic standard of living. With budget 2022, one of the very surprising things that stuck for us was that government chose again to leave those on low incomes behind. So again, when we did our analysis on budget night, as a result of government's failure to focus on low to middle income households with jobs, a couple with one earner at €30,000 received an additional 39 cents, and that's clearly not enough to keep pace with steeply rising inflation. Moving on then to employment. In Ireland, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic has brought enormous uncertainty to the Irish labour market and consequently to many families throughout the country. The pandemic's labour market impact has been very uneven, in particular when it's judged across age groups and genders and sectors of employment. And furthermore, the uncertainty remains, and many of the challenges will only really reveal themselves as the pandemic's disruption recedes. And if anyone was tuning in to the Taoiseach's presentation last night, we can see that we are still far away from that disruption receding. Here in this table, here we're attempting to identify some of the labour market consequences of the pandemic by comparing the CSO data from the final 3 months of 2020 to those for the same period in 2019. And the table also includes the CSO's COVID-19 adjusted employment and unemployment estimates. So they represent the kind of the lower bound for true employment and the upper bound for the true unemployment figure if we estimate or if we assume that both estimates include that most individuals in receipt of the short-term COVID-19 pandemic unemployment payment, which is due to wind down, would be unemployed, I beg your pardon, if the payment didn't exist. And what those figures reveal is the hidden reality of the pandemic's labour market impact, with pronounced decreases in employment and increases in unemployment. And these are in addition to the existing challenges we had pre-COVID of almost 140,000 people unemployed, over 100,000 workers underemployed, so that is they are working fewer hours than they want to and are available for, a declining participation rate and static levels of long-term unemployment. Moving on then in terms of the sectoral impact. Overall in 2020, there were 6.6 million less hours of work completed, either through job losses, declines in economic activity, COVID-19 related closures, or reduced working hours and opportunities. However, again, the distribution of these reductions varies dramatically across economic sectors. So some areas saw small increases or small decreases, and these contrast dramatically with the reductions for sectors such as accommodation and food services, which saw a reduction of 53%. cultural and recreational services, a 36% reduction, administrative services, 34% reduction, transport, 13%, construction, 13%, and retail, 5% reduction. So the largest impacted sectors are frequently those that are identified as having a larger number of female workers and a larger number of low-paid workers. And that's evident when we consider that, notwithstanding the considerable loss of hours, income tax receipts decreased by just 1% in the year to January 2021. So that indicates again that it's the lowest income earners who are most impacted by pandemic-related employment and wage losses. Moving then to long-term unemployment, it's important not to overlook the pre-pandemic labour market issues that remain. So long-term unemployment has been a major labour market challenge for some time. The number of long-term unemployed was 33,300 in 2007. It increased to over 200,000 people by 2012 before falling again to almost 37,000 in 2020. For the first time on record in late 2010, the Labour Force survey produced by the Central Statistics Office indicated that long-term unemployment accounted for more than 50% of the unemployed. And it took from then until late 2017 for that number to consistently drop below that threshold, reaching 26.5% of the unemployed in the fourth quarter of last year. Now, as this chart here shows, the transition to those high levels was quite rapid. And it's of concern that we might once again experience such a change. The experience of the 80s, for example, showed the dangers and long-lasting implications of an unemployment crisis that was characterised by high long-term unemployment rates. And it remains a policy challenge that Ireland's level of long-term unemployment remains high. And it's obviously a policy area that demands more attention. Looking then at youth unemployment, we can't obviously talk about unemployment and COVID-19 without talking about the impact it has had on youth unemployment. And here you can see again the CSO's unemployment estimates from March 2020 to January 2021 for those aged 15 to 24, the youth unemployment, and those aged above that. So they provide two estimates of unemployment: a low estimate, which reflects the normal measure of individuals without work and who are actively seeking work, and the high estimate, which adds to this all those who are in receipt of the PUP payment at that time. So if all PUP recipients were classified as unemployed, the CSO's COVID-19 adjusted unemployment measure indicated that the overall rate in January 2021 would have been 25%. That estimate rises to 56.4% for those aged 15 to 24 years and to 21.4% for those aged 25 plus. So the data suggests the existence and expected future growth of a severe youth unemployment problem. There's also a suggestion of a greater number of workers in precarious employment situations. And again, we're seeing data from the CSO in relation to that. And the growth in the number of individuals with less work hours than they wish for, or less work hours than are ideal for their family circumstances, as well as those with persistent uncertainties concerning the number and the times of the hours that they work, is a major labour market challenge. And it's one that may grow in the period ahead as things start to gradually return. Aside from that impact, this has the impact it has on the well-being of individuals and their families. It impacts their financial situation, obviously, and it adds to that working poor challenge that we outlined earlier. There are also impacts then on the state. So given that the working family payment, which was formerly known as FIS, or the Family Income Supplement, and the structure of the job seekers payments, they tend to lead to government subsidising these families' incomes, so therefore indirectly subsidising employers who create this persistent precarious employment pattern for their workers. Moving on then to education, and you can see here, in terms of education, this is an area where Ireland tends to score quite well on international indicators, and I'm sure that was something that was covered earlier on this morning. But looking here at early school leaving, Ireland has the fourth lowest early school leaving rate in the European Union at 5%, and Ireland ranked second in the European Union for the percentage of people aged 20 to 24 with at least an upper second level education at 94%. So this downward trend of early school leaving is absolutely welcome. So it's a great development, and it surpasses the national target that's set under the Europe 2020 strategy. However, and there's always a however, according to the CSO, an early school leaver is 3 times as likely to be unemployed than the general population aged 18 to 24. Only 1 in 4 of them are in employment compared to the general population for that age group, and just under half, 47%, are not economically active. So a further report by the CSO analysed the outcomes for students who started second level education between the years of 2011 and 2013. And when comparing early school leavers to those who had completed their leaving certificate, the report found that just 43.8% of early school leavers were in employment, compared to 74% of their peers who finished school, and that the median earnings for early school leavers were €65 less than their peers, so €345 per week compared to €410 per week. So despite progress that has been made in relation to early school leaving, those figures, that data there is a cause for concern. Moving on then to higher education. So we have seen that full-time enrolment in higher education has increased by almost 33% in the last decade to 186,890 students, and numbers are projected to reach 222,500 by 2030. An increasing population of school leavers then obviously demands that considerable investment is required to ensure that the higher education sector in Ireland can continue to cope. However, as has been said by other speakers, public funding for higher education in Ireland has been decreasing since 2009, despite those steadily increasing enrolments in both full and part-time education. In fact, the government's Parliamentary Budget Office, in a recent report on tertiary education funding in Ireland, estimates that funding per undergraduate student at full-time, part-time, remote and FETAC levels enrolled in 2019 was 50% lower than that in 2008. So that report presents a very clear and very detailed outline of the challenges facing the sector, and it recommends that any increases in state funding are accompanied by the recommended administrative reforms. Crucially, it recommends that funding be sourced from sustainable revenues to prevent that repetition, as Tom outlined as well, of the cuts to funding during the last economic and fiscal crisis and into this current one. Moving on then to lifelong learning. Access to lifelong learning should really be an integral part of the education system. It should address income and labour market challenges that some members of society face, particularly those I've just spoken about. Our lifelong learning participation rate is slowly improving, and it rose to 13% in 2019. Our national target is to reach 15% by 2025, as set out in the National Skills Strategy. As progress is being made though, government should consider revising this target to reach 15% by 2021 this year, and to reach 20% by 2026. And that would bring us in line with the European Union, which has a lifelong learning target of 15% by 2020. Those who are engaged in lifelong learning, however, are more likely to be professionals than low-skilled workers, and they're more likely to be employed in public administration, professional services and finance, sectors that are more likely to provide in-house training or continuous professional development, and that have policies for subsidising education than, say, the retail sector or the construction sectors. So employers in those sectors and those other sectors must be encouraged and incentivised to participate in the development of their lifelong learning strategies, because that supports both the development of the employee and it contributes to the retention rate, and obviously then the effectiveness of the business, which in turn reduces the costs associated to that business to hiring and developing and training up new staff. So it's a win-win for all concerned. And then on to skills. So, you know, while Ireland performs relatively well in terms of skills development among young people, a comparatively small share of the adult population performs well on all levels of the PIAC, the Programme for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies. So managing the digital transformation in the labour market and that shift to a green economy that we've spoken about requires investment in human capital and a well-trained and a very skilled general workforce at all levels. However, our performance on digital skills is quite concerning. Over 55% of the population have either low or basic digital skills. The skills that are easiest to automate or to outsource are routine technical skills. Educational success is now about creative solutions and critical approaches to problem solving and decision making and persuasion, to applying the knowledge that we have to different situations. It's about the capacity to live in this multifaceted world as an active and engaged citizen. A 2019 report from the OECD found that the digital transformation could compound existing socioeconomic inequalities, with the benefits in terms of earnings and opportunities accruing to a few, and then the risks falling more heavily on people with lower levels of education and skills. And this seems to constantly be the way. The report notes that 14% of all jobs are at high risk of being lost due to automation, with another 32% at risk of significant change over the next 10 to 20 years. So essentially what that means is that nearly half of the labour force will be impacted by changes to their jobs because of automation by 2040. So our training and our skills development policies have to be adapted to meet that very significant challenge. Moving on then to health. One of the most obvious concerns about the Irish healthcare system, setting aside the pandemic, is to do with access. Ireland's health system ranked 22nd out of 35 countries in 2018, according to the Health Consumer Powerhouse report that was published the following year in 2019. But on the issue of accessibility, Ireland ranked worst. The report notes that even if the waiting list target of 18 months were reached, it would still be the worst waiting time situation in Europe. And that's a piece of data that just blows my mind. We're so far away from reaching that target. And even then, even if we reached our own goal, we'd still have the worst waiting time in Europe. Irish hospitals are working near full capacity, and the occupancy rate for acute care beds is among the highest in the OECD countries. And you can see that here in this graph. While having a high utilisation rate of hospital beds can be a sign that the hospital is efficient, it can also mean that too many patients are being treated at the secondary care level rather than primary care. And we know for a fact that Ireland is among one of the lowest countries in terms of its primary healthcare provision. By comparison with other OECD countries, the share of the Irish population delaying or foregoing care is comparatively high. It's above 30%. So that means people are delaying much needed treatment because of the lack of spaces and the lack of capacity for the healthcare system to take them on. Moving on then to waiting lists. So Ireland's complex two-tier system for access to public hospital care means that private patients have a speedier access to both diagnostics and treatment, while those in the public system can spend very lengthy periods of time waiting for a first appointment with a specialist or for treatment. The official statistics suggest that 628,756 people were waiting for an outpatient appointment in March 2021, while 35,634 were waiting for treatment as an inpatient or a day case. The COVID-19 pandemic may obviously have contributed to the numbers on the waiting lists. However, as we can see in this table, there have been very high numbers on waiting lists for many years. As I said, those waiting on outpatients appointments last March numbered almost 630,000, an increase of 16,180 on November last year. And both the 2020 and the March 2021 figures represent very large increases over the figure at the end of 2014. Those waiting 18 months plus numbered 178,064, and that's the target we're trying to reduce in March 2021, and that's up from just under 157,000 in November 2020. The number waiting for inpatient appointments at 35,634 in March 2021 was less than half the number of the previous November, however. Before the onset of COVID, the Irish public hospital system was already operating under pressure from high population growth and ageing. And because of system cuts to bed capacity in the preceding decades, this is set to continue. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the insufficient preparation of countries to cope with major public health emergencies, Ireland included. Certain groups obviously will continue to experience health difficulties and will need particular policy focus, and inequalities still need to be addressed as disparities such as in life expectancy continue to be great between socioeconomic groups. So there was mention of Roma communities. There's, we also know in terms of traveller communities, they have a very low life expectancy, and we really need to have targeted measures to address this. Moving down to taxation. Government decisions to raise or reduce overall taxation revenue needs to be linked to the demands on its resources. These demands depend on what government is required to address or decides to do. The effects of the economic crisis a decade ago and the way it was handled also carry significant implications for our future taxation needs. The rapid increase in our national debt, driven by the need to borrow both to replace disappearing tax revenues and to fund emergency investments in the failing commercial banks, has increased the ongoing annual costs that are associated with servicing the national debt. Similarly, the need for the state to rescue or support so many aspects of the economy and society during the pandemic has triggered large-scale borrowing, so future liabilities to both service and repay this debt. The Department of Finance has used the European Commission 2018 Ageing Report as the basis for its assumptions from 2020 to 2070, which are summarised here in this slide. The report anticipates an increase in the older population, so those aged 65 years plus, from approximately 712,000 people in 2020 to 1.2 million in 2040, and to a peak of 1.49 million in 2060. Over that same period, the proportion of those of working age will decline as a percentage of the population, and the old age dependency ratio will increase from almost 5 people of working age for every older person today to less than 3 for every older person from 2040 onwards. So while these increases imply a range of necessary policy initiatives in the decades to come, there is an inevitability that an overall higher level of taxation will have to be collected if we want to pay for those much needed age-related supports. We believe that there is merit in developing a tax package that places less emphasis on taxing people and organisations for their valuable work and their enterprise, or on the value that they add and what they contribute to the common good, but rather to tax people and organisations based on the value they subtract by their use of common resources. So there was mention there of Mariana Mazzucato's work in terms of looking at how R&D has gone towards kind of private enterprises, and this is certainly something that needs to be brought into discussions around taxation. Whatever changes are made should also be guided by the need to build a fairer taxation system, one which adheres to the core policy objective of collecting sufficient tax to ensure full participation in society for all through a fair tax system in which those who have more pay more, while those who have less pay less. So how do we go about doing all of that? Seems simple enough, I suppose. In Social Justice Ireland, we believe that every person has 7 core rights that need to be part of the vision for the future. So they have the right to sufficient income and to live life with dignity, the right to meaningful work, the right to appropriate accommodation, the right to relevant education, the right to essential healthcare, the right to real participation, and the right to cultural respect. And these are themes that Hugh touched on in his presentation in terms of how you might actually deliver on that. For these 7 rights to be vindicated, greater public expenditure to fund a broader provision of services is much needed. So in that respect, as part of a new social contract, government should ensure that future tax and spending policy is focused on building up Ireland's social infrastructure, prioritising areas such as healthcare, social housing, education, childcare, and early education facilities. And we did a large piece on this last year in relation to the social contract, and our annual policy conference last year was dedicated to this theme. These are areas in particular where Ireland is experiencing an infrastructure deficit. Without adequate future planning for the kinds of social infrastructure and services we need, it won't be possible to maintain, never mind improve, the current standards of living for all citizens, from children to older people. Once COVID-19 has been defeated, all countries will face major challenge to decide if the experience of the last 20 or so months and our response to it should shape the future of our society. We must learn from this experience and tackle the inequality and exclusion that we failed to address up to now. What we see clearly now is that the healthcare services that struggled in normal times have been provided with significant additional resources that we were told couldn't even be considered prior to the pandemic. What was claimed to be impossible before now seems to be the only sensible course of action. All that suggests is that there is something profoundly wrong with our social contract. Once COVID-19 has been addressed successfully, it's crucial that we face up to those radical reforms that are needed if we're to reverse that prevailing thrust of policy making over the past 4 decades, which has failed to eliminate the inequality and exclusion that mires our society. To achieve the vision set out, Social Justice Ireland has proposed a policy framework for a new social contract that identifies 5 key policy outcomes and sets out key areas for action within each. We need the investment in infrastructure and services to develop a thriving economy. We need taxation to fund this. We need good governance to ensure that people have a say in shaping the decisions that impact them. And we also need to ensure that everything that is done is sustainable, environmentally, economically, and socially. Each of these 5 key policy outcomes must be achieved if we're to deliver a more just and sustainable society. It's not enough that 3 or 4 out of the 5 might be achieved while neglecting the other areas. All 5 must be worked on simultaneously. It's not a question of getting the economy right and everything else will follow, because we've seen that approach tried and fail. This has to end. So we've looked at how our rights under the social contract are currently being realised or otherwise in the areas of income, work, education and healthcare. So let's look at some potential policy alternatives in those areas. Firstly, to prioritise investment. Large-scale investment programmes are desperately needed to ensure a sustainable and inclusive recovery from the current crisis, which operates in jobs-intensive areas and assists growth, as well as social and infrastructural deficits. The focus would need to be tailored to each individual country or region, but might include the development of renewable energy sources, health and social care infrastructure, housing, education and early childhood care infrastructure. We need to implement the European Pillar of Social Rights, as we've discussed today. We need to establish processes involving social partners and civil society partners to implement the pillar in ways that are legally binding and that aim for equal opportunities and access to the labour market, fair working conditions and social protection and inclusion. We need to strengthen our welfare system. Government needs to introduce social protection schemes that are far more resilient and that tackle inequalities within the present systems, ensuring that there is equal access to services and to strengthen social cohesion. The national minimum wage must be replaced over time with the living wage to ensure that we are providing that floor for people who are in work. We need to adopt effective labour market measures, so activation measures in the wake of the pandemic, which focus on supporting unemployed people, aiming to maintain and develop appropriate skills and to not be accompanied by the threatened loss of welfare benefits or assistance. We need employment measures that are not implemented in a way that removes income security and increases in-work poverty. We need to tackle low pay by supporting the living wage and by moving towards a basic income system. We need to start to tackle low-paid employment by supporting the widespread adoption of the living wage, including giving public recognition to organisations, including small and medium enterprises, that commit to paying the living wage and to consider moving towards a basic income system. We need to develop sustainable approaches to taxation and increase the tax take. Sustainable and inclusive growth requires approaches to raising revenue that generate enough to support the vital services and to move to a social investment approach. Measures should not disproportionately negatively affect low-income groups, and that means, amongst other things, avoiding increases in indirect taxes on essential items. We need to tackle tax evasion and the grey economy, which are a particular problem in some countries, and certainly, you know, tax avoidance measures here are a particular issue. Tax evasion must be tackled and fair taxation systems introduced in which all sectors of society, including the corporate sector, contribute a fair share, and those who can afford do pay more. We need to consider how government can become an employer of last resort. So given the ongoing impact of unemployment, governments in badly affected countries should consider being an employer of last resort through voluntary programs framed so as not to distort the market economy. We need to ensure inclusive governance and promote social dialogue, engage with key stakeholders to ensure that groups at risk of poverty and social inclusion and unemployed people can influence policy direction and implementation, and that their experiences become part of the dialogue with national and European institutions to try and repair social cohesion and political legitimacy. We have seen the damage that is wrought by policies and legislation that is drafted without the relevant stakeholders. It is doomed to fail. We need poverty proofing and monitoring. All government decisions should be subject to a poverty proofing process that ensures that actions taken won't increase poverty under any heading or cumulatively impact negatively on any particular group. We need to integrate social assessments of the impacts of policy changes into decision-making processes that focus beyond the short-term cost savings and use macroeconomic modelling processes to assess the impact of proposed changes in social policies. We need to avail of the social investment aspects of the programming of EU funds to fund measures that address the social situation, including supports for initiatives set out in the EU's social investment package, such as supporting social enterprises or facilitating the implementation of the recommendations on investing in children. And we need to commit to appropriate regional strategies that ensure that investment is balanced between regions with due regard to sub-regional areas, aiming to ensure that rural development policy is underpinned by goals of social, economic and environmental well-being. We saw reports during the pandemic of people starting to move from urban areas out to towns and more rural areas, but that, if it's to be sustainable into the long term, requires investment to make sure that there is an economic activity to sustain those communities. Now is the time for creative thinking about what society should look like when the pandemic has passed. Business as usual is not acceptable, and delivering the leadership required demands that implementation of that engaged citizens, foster trust and build a more just society. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Colette. A comprehensive manifesto, I think, if I ever heard one, and really something I think that we all can take something from, as all of the papers today were. Now, just to open it up a small bit, we, as I said, we've our 4 speakers are still with us, and just to, as they might say, fire a few questions at you. Can I start off with Hugh? Hugh, we have a question here. How do you think the data that was collected in respect of the pillar might overlap or inform the production of well-being indicators?
Yeah, it slightly begs the question what data will be collected, because I think there's still a bit of a debate going on how intensive it is. But I think that it can be very useful if we have data that covers all the different principles. So we're not just looking at data on employment, we're looking at social data, we're looking at the quality data, but more particularly, I think, if the data is broken down to look at particular vulnerable groups, because often the difficulty is in social policies is the lack of a breakdown of data to see the groups who are most vulnerable. They're often left out of the data, and we don't see how policies are affecting them. And I think if they're included, we can begin to see a comprehensive look at people's well-being.
Yeah, I Colette, would you come in on that? How do you feel in relation to collecting that kind of data?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those issues. I mean, there was a presentation this morning that was organised by the Taoiseach's office, and the governor of the central bank spoke with it. So he's an ex-New Zealand minister who was involved in their wellbeing budget. And you know, his view on it was that what happened in New Zealand was that they looked at the kind of the needs of people. You know, then they built indicators based on kind of, I suppose, focus group interviews, data collection that they already had, and they built these well-being indicators. And then from there, from the data that was being collected under those, they then prioritized. So I think their first budget was on child poverty. So, you know, I suppose it's around, look, rather than the approach that seems to be taken here, which is build the indicators and then go look for the data. I think there's a lot to be done in terms of how we want, like what we want wellbeing to actually look like, and then determine what indicators and collection processes we need from there.
Yeah, Tom, in terms of collating that material, I mean, do we need a shift in both emphasis and focus towards it than what exists and has existed for a very long time?
Well, we do indeed, Mick, and I mean, for many long years, it was clear that there were certain types of data that just weren't collected, and sometimes for good reasons. But for example, we didn't have any wealth data in Ireland until a few years ago. It just wasn't considered interesting. But the CSO, for example, do have a limited resource set. I would give them more, but we are getting new data sets now. For example, we've got better data channels from revenue commissioners through to the CSO now, and that means that we've got much better income data than we had before, and it allows us to look at transitions in and out of the labour market, what's happening to different groups and so forth. But in terms of, I suppose, a kind of a lot of secondary data, it just isn't there. And it's not just an Irish issue. It tends to be the case in a lot of places. But I think sometimes we have to rely on kind of synthetic data. So like ones like deprivation rates, for example, are based upon responses, and then that's considered to be a proxy for deprivation. We perhaps should be looking at, are there ways that we can kind of get into that? Job quality would be another one, and perhaps a greater willingness to use kind of survey data in that regard, even if it seems to be developing. It seems to be, you know, ancillary or not directly relevant, but maybe kind of getting at something through a range of different indicators, and then that all feeding into the overall well-being from kind of subsidiary modules.
I'm with you. And if I could change tact slightly for a minute, Sheamus, Boland, and turn to you. Sheamus, I note there you had a comment in the chat section. Unfortunately, we've had a carbon tax since 2013, which succeeded in raising costs for families, especially in rural areas, but has not reduced the use of fossil fuels. This is because the tax was not used to develop alternatives. I'd say there wouldn't be a lot of argument with that, Sheamus, but how do we advance things from there? I mean, is it your position that the likes of revenue raising, like through carbon tax, should be halted until such time as proper alternatives are developed in terms of moving towards a just transition?
I think, Michael, it's really an honesty about what you call tax and what sort of tax you're collecting. As far as rural families are concerned, they're just collecting, it's another form of tax. And those who implement these kind of taxes say, well, we're introducing this tax to stop you from using fossil fuels. But unfortunately, you can't stop using fossil fuels if you haven't an alternative. It's a bit like, you know, with the tax on the plastic bag, you did have a choice. So many people chose not to use the plastic bag, so the tax worked. But the tax shouldn't really be called a carbon tax, because if it's a carbon tax, it must work. Therefore, it must stop people using less carbon type vehicles, etc. But if you live in rural Ireland, you have to use cars and you have to use transport. So in a sense, what happened was various data that we do know, particularly collected by the Vincentian Partnership on incomes and family income, showed that the gap between the urban and rural typical family income rose by something like up to €100 a week, mainly caused by transport costs. So carbon tax shouldn't really be called carbon tax because it's not actually doing anything to change the carbon situation. It just raises more tax, which goes into the general area. But if you really have a carbon tax and you use it for retrofit, different alternative transport, better chargers for electric vehicles, well, then you can call it a carbon tax.
Just coming to you on that, like, because in some ways the whole issue around carbon tax and revenue raising, and I think there's a general agreement that we have to raise more revenue to provide proper services. Where would you stand on the carbon tax as it's being implemented?
Yeah, actually, a carbon tax that is really succeeding will generate zero revenue because there won't be any carbon left. So a carbon tax will always be a temporary measure, and therefore, while generally it's a bad idea to kind of hypothecate taxes, so income tax goes to health, for example, or something like that, better to put into a pot. When it comes to environmental taxes, it does make, because it completely makes sense to use the revenues or the yield for mitigation or to provide alternatives. So the idea is that you have this yield coming in over a 10, 20, 30 year period, and that revenue is used to pay for the carbon transition or the zero carbon transition. And Sheamus is absolutely correct. There are no alternatives in terms of transport. Public transport is practically non-existent in rural Ireland. And it is a particular issue in Ireland because we have a low population density, but we also happen to have a very diffuse population with very, very small urban centres and large rural areas in between with a very, very weak public transport network. And again, this is one of the reasons why I was really emphasising that accessible and affordable public transport was very, very important. And that's why I was talking about sequencing. So I think carbon tax is part of the solution, but sequencing and hypothecating are essential. So at the same time, you're rolling out this public transport infrastructure, which is accessible and affordable. And at the same time, you're punishing choices that are still within that set. So if you're in rural Ireland, you have to use your car because you have no alternative, but you don't necessarily have to use an SUV, for example. So you could have additional taxes on what I'd call luxury emissions, which could be SUVs, or it could be airplane travel abroad, or whatever it might be. So I do think carbon tax are part of the medium-term solution. And of course, it does affect behavior in urban areas, but at the same time, use those resources to provide opportunities for people to actually have a choice. And then it is a carbon tax, a tax like tobacco that you have a choice about using. Because Sheamus is right. At the moment, if you're living in rural Ireland, you can't use your bike because it's often too far to the school or to the shops. There's no public transport options. Obviously, you can't walk, so you have to take your car. Your only choice then is how efficient the car is. So I agree with Sheamus completely, while also mentioning that, you know, it's about sequencing, but ultimately carbon taxes, I do think, are part of the medium-term solution here, if that makes sense.
Just briefly, Tom, on that, when you mentioned that it's part of the sequencing, obviously you can see that point. One issue that would arise, would strike me, certainly in light of everything we've heard, particularly in recent weeks, what happens when we don't have time for sequencing? We are where we are, to use that awful phrase.
We are absolutely, and that's why, you know, I would have liked to have seen budget 2019, 2020, 21, 22, basically rolling out massive investments in a public transport fleet for all of Ireland, which, by the way, doesn't have to be big trains, it doesn't have to be big buses, it can be small buses which link up rural towns. It doesn't have to be all day long, but these opportunities or options have to be part of the mix. So we should be doing that immediately, and there's no reason that we can't. And of course, these could be eventually green hydrogen, in short term electric perhaps. But you know, that then gives people the options. At the same time, improving infrastructure within the urban areas as well, where ultimately we would ideally like more more people to be living, and then dealing with all of the other areas as well. So you're right, we don't have time. We should be doing this now, and frankly, the mix that we have in terms of tax and spend is just not right at the moment.
No, I think we can all agree on that one. Hugh, just turning to you, it's been brought up by a couple of you in papers. I think it's very valid in relation to how we addressed the pandemic, as opposed to how the economic collapse was addressed, and in particular the deployment of significant extra resources to the health service, which we were told could not be provided. Do you think that we can enter a new paradigm now on the basis of the deployment of public resources to the likes of the health service for the pandemic, and it to be some form of a model as we move into the future?
Yes, I'm sure that it's a really important development. I think that there is a change in mindset, that people have suddenly begun to value the need for these services and that you have to pay for them. And that's what in Ireland we particularly lagged in doing. And I think I see it not just in Ireland, I see it across countries across Europe. The response to the pandemic has been quite surprising in the terms of the scale of the response from member states. So it's a very good report on looking at the different responses by the European Network on Social Inclusion and the expert on that. And so it wasn't just in Ireland that this happened, it happened everywhere. And I think that is the basis for a change. There's no guarantee that we will definitely keep that, but it seems to me it provides a sort of start of a model which, if you connect with the pillar of social rights, I think is really useful. Also, I think the other thing that's happened, you've seen on the ground, certainly in Ireland, I have to chair a network of community organisations in Dublin and in the city. A lot more cooperation between government agencies and community organisations, and the recognition, I think, of the role that's played by community organisations in supporting and linking them into services. And I think all of that is part of the change that we'll see. And if I could just go back to the original point on the question of well-being and data on that, I think it links into that. What is it that we want to measure as we're doing? And I think it's not a totally new idea, the idea of measuring well-being. You quoted, I think, or somebody quoted New Zealand. In fact, the work that was done that informed New Zealand having indicators on well-being was done, I think, mainly by Anne-Catherine Guillot in the Luxembourg Institute. And she looked at that and has done some very good work on indicators of well-being from the data that is currently available around Europe. And also, if you look at the work that she did with Eric Marlier and Tony Atkinson on measuring what matters to children and children's well-being, we now have quite a much improved set of indicators on children. So a lot of that already exists. There are gaps that could be filled further, but I think we have a basis to start straight away saying what are the important things to measure. And that is the start of a basis for a change in how we look at things like services and access to health. And I think just the other thing on health that's been really important during COVID is the extent that it's shown up the importance of the social determinants of health. How much the factors about your housing conditions, the environment that you're living in, the access to open space, all those things affect your education levels, affect your health dramatically. And I think COVID has shown that. So we have to look at all those social determinants as being important to people's way of life. And I think that is a sea shift in how people are seeing this. And I would be more optimistic than I've been for quite a few years, that I think there is a change in the public climate. And we see it in opinion polls in Ireland, that people want a change. They want a change that is more inclusive. And I think we have something to build on.
If I could finish with you on that note, would you share the optimism coming out of the pandemic that we've been given enough food for thought to move in a different direction?
Would I share the optimism? I suppose I'm hopeful, if not optimistic. I think the evidence is there. I think he's absolutely right in terms of we have seen that the areas that have been most impacted by the COVID numbers are those who would traditionally have lower incomes in terms of their demographics. I think that creates in itself part of an argument towards basic income. If people, have enough to live on, would they necessarily put themselves at risk going to low paid precarious work, you know, in the middle of a pandemic. So I think there's, you know, in terms of creating an evidence base around the social determinants of health, I think certainly there's much to work on there. There's a lot that we can use there. Can I say something in relation to what Tom and Sheamus were talking about?
Please do, yeah.
When they talked about thank you, when they talked about the carbon tax. I mean, obviously Social Justice Ireland supports a carbon tax, but as part of, you know, ring fencing it as part of a just transition package, along with other environmental taxes, and the reduction of tax expenditures around tax reliefs around potentially environmentally damaging things and goods. And I suppose I'm intrigued by the suggestion that maybe it should be on certain types of vehicles, or maybe people should be incentivized to use different types of vehicles. And I know certainly where I live is rural. My children's school is 2 miles up the road and we have to drive because there's no footpaths. But it's that the majority of cars that I would see around here would be like 10 years plus. So even at that, I suppose, unless you incentivize people to buy newer, better, more efficient vehicles, or, you know, how do you really implement that type of a policy in areas that don't traditionally buy new cars unless they're worn to death?
A very good point, and one of a number I'd suggest that we're going to have to address, because notwithstanding the pandemic itself, I think the whole climate crisis is going to ensure that we're going to have to change the way we live completely in so many different ways, which I've no doubt in the coming years in this particular annual event will be tackled in particular ways that should be very interesting, I would thought, because as I say, I think more and more they're going to have to listen to policymakers and science to an extent that certainly in the last 10 or 20 years, they have not been doing. All of that, of course, is for another day. Today, I have to say, I think was very interesting. We had some fantastic papers, both those produced domestically and from Europe. And I would like to thank all of our speakers before handing you back to Sean Healy.
And thanks, Mick. You've done a powerful job on a very, very good day. We've had a very good situation and a very good, as you said, a very good set of papers. I think the topic is very relevant, as has been pointed out. And I think the more I just reflect on it, it basically shows us that, or it convinces us that it requires major political will to ensure that the European Union can effectively meet the major challenges presented by the rapidly changing new realities facing the planet, the continent, and its individual members. Like there were references to things like the transitions we're facing, climate and digital and demographic. And then as well as that, we have Brexit and COVID as kind of two things that are going on that are causing a lot of immediate hassle. And yet the others are at a very deep level. But to get the support required to deliver the response required, it seems to me that a primary focus must be on tackling the damage to social cohesion across the European Union caused by the last crisis, which is still continuing. The impact I'm talking about on a lot of people, and also on ensuring that this damage is repaired, you know, the amount of it that has persisted. But the stated aim of the European Pillar of Social Rights is to take account of the changing realities of Europe's society and the world of work. And I think failure to deliver a balanced policy approach between economic, social, and environmental policy across the Union for several decades has contributed to the crisis. And that's been highlighted, I think, quite well today. And Europe finds itself, as a result, at a crisis point that it could have avoided if it took action early enough. Ireland, very much the same, in the same could be said of Ireland. But every country in the European Union has a role to play, and Ireland is no exception. And I think Ireland hasn't been doing all that well in terms of reducing poverty, in terms of dealing with persistent long-term unemployment, and also hasn't been doing well in the reality that increasingly public services are being delivered by the private sector. I don't think that's good for the long term. Our addressing of sustainability issues has been rhetorical rather than real. So what I'm saying really, I suppose, is we have a very substantial amount of work, portfolio of work to do if we're to deliver on the kind of society that people are, I think, that demanding at the moment, and that people want after their experience of COVID and so on. But to do that, I think it's critically important to deliver the European Pillar of Social Rights in its fullness and not in its weakest dimension only, to develop it in its fullness. And I want to say a special thank you to all the speakers who did a great job, really, and to Santina Bertolesi, to Michelle Murphy, Bea Cantillon, Lena Carr, Anna Gwillan, Maria Permisudo, Hugh Fraser, Sheamus Boland, Tom MacDonald, and Colette Bennett. I think just recalling it, looking back, or just listing them there, shows the sheer extent of what we've been listening to all day. And I think all of the papers were actually very well prepared, and we were delighted to get them, and we're very grateful to the authors of the various papers, and we wish to thank them as they have made a major contribution, obviously, to this conference, making it possible, and so on. I want to also say a few other things, that the papers, all those papers, will actually be on the website. The book is actually on the website at the moment. That is the book with all of the papers in it. So that's available already up there. There'll be a recording of all the sessions on our website in the coming days. So people might, there was a lot of stuff done there, and people might want to dip back in there to check out different presentations that'll be broken up. There's, I suppose I also want to say a special thank you to the Social Justice Ireland team, and especially to Suzanne Rogers, who has been driving the bus, I suppose might be a good way of putting it. Absolutely, she's done a terrific job all day, and after one or two initial scares in which we were afraid the technology was going to go down, it actually has worked out very well, and fair play to Suzanne, did a fantastic job on that. And I also want to say a special word of thanks, finally, to yourself, Mick. You did a powerful job in pulling it all together, keeping people to time, which was remarkable, terrific altogether. Having that many speakers and finishing up almost on time is great. But also keeping a sharp focus in the Q&A and in the discussion, because I think you bring a whole kind of perspective to it that's excellent altogether. So we're delighted with that, with your presence. We're very grateful that you do it, and that you've been doing it for a number of years now. We'll be coming back to you again. We will give you advance notice. But anyway, just to say a very sincere thank you for a job very well done. And with that, I think I am not forgetting anything, hopefully. And I just want to say that I'm glad to bring, or grateful to bring to an end the 34th conference in this series. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up and look forward to another day, as Mick said earlier on. Thanks, Mick. Thanks to the whole team. Thanks to all the speakers, and thanks particularly to the participants, particularly those who have persisted right up to the end, which is terrific altogether, and much, much appreciated. We had quite an international audience during the day, very interested, obviously, in the topic, and we're delighted to have that. And the recording and the recordings and the papers and the book will all be available to people, and they're all available free of charge. So thanks again to everybody. Thanks, Mick. We'll let it go.